The empty red carpet. The flashbulbs exploded like tiny suns, painting Keanu Reeves in white light. The carpet beneath his feet shimmered red as if it had been dipped in wine and fame. Reporters shouted his name. Microphones fought for his voice, and the world leaned closer to hear what he might say. Yet, inside his chest there was only stillness. Not the peaceful kind, but the hollow kind that echoes when meaning disappears. He smiled politely, the same quiet, gentle smile that made millions call him humble, but tonight it felt rehearsed, like a role he couldn't escape. The laughter, the applause, the admiration, all of it passed through him like smoke through glass. When he finally escaped into the limousine, the noise outside dissolved into a hum. The tinted windows shut the world out, but not the ache. Hollywood had made him a symbol of mystery and kindness, a rare soul in a city of mirrors, yet fame had also wrapped invisible chains around him. He had money, admiration, and a name known across continents, but he felt farther from himself than ever. His reflection in the dark window looked unfamiliar, like someone wearing a mask made of calm. He whispered to himself, "Is this all there is?" And his own voice sounded foreign, fragile. The car rolled through the glowing streets of Los Angeles, where neon lights blinked like restless eyes. Billboards of his latest film towered above him, his face 10 stories tall, smiling down on a city that adored an image more than a man. As the limo slowed at a red light, his eyes caught something small. A man sitting on the curb, wrapped in an old blanket, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Still breathing. Still grateful." The man looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. It wasn't pity that struck Keanu, but recognition. The stranger's eyes were tired but clear, filled with a peace Keanu hadn't known in years. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He lay in his quiet penthouse, surrounded by luxury and silence. The city murmured below, but his thoughts were louder. A collage of faces, applause, interviews, and empty laughter. He thought about his mother's faith, the small wooden cross she kept by the window when he was a boy. Back then, she would tell him, "The world will try to buy your soul with lights, son. Don't let it." He had smiled then, too young to understand. Now, that memory returned like a whisper that wouldn't fade. In the small hours of dawn, he dreamed. He was walking on the same red carpet, but this time the crowd was gone. Cameras clicked in the distance, but their flashes revealed nothing but empty seats. At the end of the carpet stood a man, barefoot, dressed in white, his face calm, his hands scarred. Keanu felt drawn to him, though no words were spoken. The man simply looked at him with eyes that saw through every wall he had built. "You've been searching," the figure said softly, "but not where truth lives." Keanu woke up gasping, a chill running down his spine. The dream felt more real than any movie scene he had ever lived. The next morning, his assistant called to confirm another press interview, another magazine cover, another premiere. He almost said yes out of habit, but something in him resisted. "Cancel it," he said quietly. "All of it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that only happens when someone realizes a change too big to name has begun. Over the next few days, Keanu disappeared from the spotlight. No statements, no interviews. The tabloids invented their own stories. Reeves retreats to prepare for new role. Actor suffers burnout. Hollywood's saint goes silent. None were true. The truth was simpler, quieter. Keanu was tired of performing his piece. He wanted to find it. He began walking, not for exercise, but for solitude. Through the less glamorous parts of Los Angeles, where the streets smelled of rain and survival, and no one cared about celebrity. He would stop at small diners, drink coffee alone, listen to strangers' stories. One afternoon, he returned to the spot where he had seen the homeless man. The man was still there, sketching on a piece of cardboard with a dull pencil. Keanu sat beside him without speaking. The man smiled faintly and said, "Didn't expect company from a movie star." Keanu chuckled softly. Didn't expect wisdom from a cardboard sign. The man's eyes sparkled. "We don't choose where grace finds us, do we?" For the first time in a long while, Keanu didn't have a clever reply. He asked, How do you stay grateful when you have nothing?" The man pointed upward. "I do have something. Someone watches over me. You just forgot he watches over you too." His words landed gently but firmly, like raindrops that sink deep. That night, Keanu couldn't stop thinking about the man's calm faith. The idea that someone who had lost everything could still feel rich in spirit unsettled and inspired him. He realized he had spent years building a life that looked full but felt empty. He had wealth without purpose, success without peace. The man by the curb had the opposite. Nothing in his hands, but something powerful in his heart. He began reading again. Not scripts, but old books his mother once kept. Among them was a Bible with her handwriting in the margins. On one page she had written, "The greatest victory is not fame, but faith." He stared at that sentence until tears blurred the ink. Days turned into weeks. The silence became a teacher. He stopped seeking applause and started seeking understanding. He attended a small church service one Sunday under a borrowed name, sitting in the back pew unnoticed. There were no lights, no production, no cameras, just people singing softly, some broken, some healed, all real. The pastor spoke about how the world glorifies crowns of gold, but true glory came from a crown of thorns, from sacrifice, love, and humility. Keanu sat frozen. He felt something inside him stir. A quiet voice, maybe his conscience, maybe something divine, whispering, "This is what you've been missing." When the service ended, he stayed seated long after everyone had left. He didn't pray with words, only with silence. That night, as the city glittered below his window, he looked up at the sky and said softly, "If you're real, if you're there, help me find what matters." It wasn't a cinematic moment, no thunder, no angels, just a man and his fragile hope. But it was enough. For the first time in decades, Keanu felt like he wasn't performing for the world. He was reaching for something higher, and somewhere deep inside, a small light flickered to life. Not the light of cameras, but of something eternal. The mirror and the mountain. The city was still asleep when Keanu Reeves left his apartment that morning. The streets were wet from an overnight drizzle, and the air carried the faint smell of rain and exhaust. He walked with no destination, just a quiet urge to move, to breathe something unfiltered. The sky was a dull silver, the kind of color that made everything else seem honest. No filters, no red carpets, no expectations. He wore a simple gray hoodie and jeans, blending easily into the slow heartbeat of dawn. For the first time in years, no one recognized him. It felt like freedom and fear woven together. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay where he had been, not in that life of flashing lights and shallow praise. He wanted silence, not applause, truth, not performance. His heart felt heavy yet strangely hopeful, as though something invisible had begun to pull him toward an unseen horizon. He ended up renting a small cabin high in the mountains outside Los Angeles, surrounded by whispering pines and the faint murmur of a nearby stream. It was the opposite of everything Hollywood stood for. There was no Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no noise except the wind that moved through the trees like a living hymn. He had brought only a few things with him: a Bible his mother had once read, a notebook, a few books on philosophy and kindness, and an old guitar he hadn't touched in years. The caretaker of the cabin, a weathered man named Elias, handed him the keys and said, "The mountain doesn't talk much, but it listens better than any soul I've met." Keanu smiled softly, pocketed the keys, and stepped into a new kind of silence. The first night there was difficult. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was raw. Without city lights, the stars looked like open eyes staring down from eternity. He felt exposed beneath them, stripped of the armor fame had given him. His thoughts wandered to every choice, every role, every moment where he had smiled for cameras while something inside him begged for meaning. He realized he had spent decades living for other people's stories, never fully writing his own. The fame that once defined him now felt like a cage built of light. He whispered into the night, "God, are you there? I'm listening." The words were awkward, uncertain, like the first steps of a child learning to walk. But they were real, and that was new. Days passed, each one slower than the last. He woke early, watched the sunrise spread gold over the valley, made coffee, and sat by the window in silence. Sometimes he read the Bible, tracing his mother's handwritten notes in the margins. Little thoughts, prayers, and reminders that love was the language of heaven. Other times he simply sat and thought about the kind of man he had become. He had been generous, kind, patient, yes, but had he been whole? He realized that even his kindness had often been quiet guilt, a way to balance the emptiness inside. Now he wanted something deeper, something unshakable. One afternoon, while hiking a narrow path up the mountain, he slipped and scraped his arm on a sharp rock. The sting was small, but it reminded him of something, that real life hurts, and maybe that was the point. As he climbed higher, he reached a clearing where the wind carried the scent of pine and snow. He sat on a flat stone, looking at the world stretched below him. Tiny cars, distant cities, clouds drifting lazily. For the first time he felt small but not insignificant. The world didn't revolve around him, and that realization brought peace instead of pain. He whispered, "Maybe this is what you meant by surrender." That night he wrote in his notebook, "Fame taught me how to be seen. Faith is teaching me how to be invisible and still be whole." The thought startled him. He read it twice, realizing it was true. In the silence of that mountain, he was learning that he didn't need to be admired to have purpose. He just needed to be aligned, with goodness, with truth, with something beyond himself. A week later, Elias, the caretaker, stopped by with supplies. The old man noticed Keanu sitting quietly by the stream, barefoot, skipping stones across the surface. "You're not like the others who rent this place," Elias said, lowering himself onto a nearby log. "Most come here to escape. You look like you came here to find." Keanu nodded slowly. "Maybe I'm looking for God," he said softly. Elias smiled, his weathered face creasing like old parchment. "God isn't lost, son, we are. But he waits right where we left him." Those words lingered long after Elias left. That evening, as the last light faded, Keanu sat by the fireplace watching the flames dance. He thought about his old life, the premieres, the adoration, the interviews where he was asked the same hollow questions about success and celebrity. None of it felt real anymore. He wondered how many people in that world were secretly aching the way he had been, trapped in noise and never noticing the silence waiting underneath. He realized that true peace wasn't the absence of chaos. It was learning how to carry stillness through it. One night, as rain drummed softly on the roof, Keanu dreamed again. He was standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection wasn't his. It was the man he had seen in the first dream, the one in white with kind eyes and scarred hands. The man spoke gently. "You keep trying to fix yourself with broken tools. Let me rebuild you." Keanu reached out to touch the mirror, and the glass rippled like water. When he woke, tears were on his face and his heart felt lighter. The next morning, he found himself humming a melody while brewing coffee. It was simple, wordless, yet it filled the cabin like sunlight. He hadn't realized it yet, but something inside him had shifted. The emptiness that once haunted him was no longer a void. It was becoming a space for something new to grow. He wasn't healed, not yet, but he was beginning to believe healing was possible. Later that week, a small bird flew into the cabin through an open window, panicked and fluttering. Keanu tried to guide it out gently, but the bird kept crashing into the glass, trying to escape the wrong way. Finally, he cupped his hand softly around it and carried it to the open air. When the bird flew free, he whispered, "I get it now." For so long, he had been like that bird, flying toward illusions that looked like freedom but were just reflections. That night, as he watched the stars again, he finally spoke aloud without fear or doubt. "I don't want fame anymore," he said. "I want faith. I don't want to be remembered. I want to be redeemed." The words felt heavy and true, like stones laid into the foundation of a new life. He didn't know what this journey would cost him, friends, contracts, reputation, but for the first time, he didn't care. He had spent half his life chasing applause. Now he wanted only to chase grace. and as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint echo of rain, he felt something sacred in that moment. A quiet knowing that he was not alone. Somewhere, beyond the clouds and the stars, the one he had been searching for was already waiting, patient and kind. The man by the crosswalk. The wind carried the smell of city dust and distant ocean salt when Keanu Reeves returned from the mountain. The silence of the woods had carved something new into him, a patience, a gentleness that could not fit inside the noise of Los Angeles. He stepped onto the streets of Hollywood like a man walking through a dream he no longer belonged to. The billboards still showed his face, his name still glittered across movie posters, and strangers still pointed at him with whispers of admiration. But he felt like a guest in his own story. He had once believed success was about climbing higher. Now, every step downward toward humility felt like freedom. He moved into a small apartment on the quieter side of the city, a neighborhood with cracked sidewalks and old trees whose roots bent the pavement. It was nothing like the penthouses he once knew, but there was a strange warmth in its imperfection. He no longer had assistants, publicists, or security guards. He made his own coffee, answered no one's calls, and let the days stretch like pages of an unwritten book. People in the neighborhood recognized him, of course. They always did. But he had mastered the art of silence. When children waved, he smiled and waved back. When old women at the market blessed him, he bowed slightly. Fame had turned him into a mirror reflecting whatever people wanted to see. Now he wanted to be a window through which something real could shine. One rainy afternoon, he stopped at a crosswalk near a downtown church. Cars rushed by, splashing through puddles, horns echoing through the gray air. Standing beside him was a man in worn clothes holding a grocery bag full of old Bibles and sandwiches wrapped in foil. The man's beard was thick and gray, his hands rough from years of work, but his eyes shone with the kind of peace Keanu had only begun to understand. When the light turned red, the man stepped into the street, not to cross, but to hand one of his sandwiches to a boy huddled under a bridge. The boy took it hesitantly, whispering a thank you too soft for the city to hear. When the man returned, Keanu said quietly, "You do this often." The man smiled, his teeth slightly crooked. "Every day, brother. Some call it madness. I call it ministry." Keanu asked his name, and the man said, "Jacob, just Jacob. That's enough." They began talking as they walked along the sidewalk. Jacob explained that he ran a small street mission with a few volunteers. "We don't have a building, just hearts," he said. "Every week we walk the streets and feed whoever's hungry. Food for the body, hope for the soul." Something about the man's calm tone and unshaken joy fascinated Keanu. He had met people who pretended to be kind for cameras, people who donated for headlines, but this man was different. There was no performance in him. His words didn't echo with pride, but with gratitude. Keanu asked how he kept going when the world seemed so broken. Jacob looked up at the sky and said, "Because broken things are what God loves to fix." That sentence struck Keanu like lightning. Simple, quiet, but filled with weight. In the days that followed, Keanu began visiting Jacob's street mission. They met under a highway bridge where the city's forgotten slept. He helped distribute sandwiches, bottled water, blankets, and sometimes just smiles. No one there cared who he was. To them, he was just another man trying to help. And for the first time in decades, that was enough. He felt no cameras watching, no audience waiting, only the quiet rhythm of service. There were moments when the sun fell just right, and he would catch the laughter of people sharing bread they did not have enough of. And something in him whispered, "This is what love feels like." Jacob often spoke softly as they worked, sharing thoughts that stayed in Keanu's mind long after. "The world teaches us to shine," Jacob once said, handing out warm soup. "But the light of heaven doesn't blind. It heals. That's the difference." Keanu wrote that down in his notebook later that night. He began filling pages with Jacob's sayings, short, profound, and full of quiet power. Weeks passed, and the media began to notice Keanu's absence from public events again. Rumors spread that he was retiring, burned out, or secretly ill. He ignored them all. The only headlines that mattered to him now were the ones written on the faces of people he helped. Smiles, gratitude, tears that didn't ask for pity. The more he gave, the lighter he felt. Fame had once been a fire that burned his peace. Now, kindness was water that cooled his soul. One night, after a long day at the mission, Jacob invited Keanu to the small church nearby. The building was old, the wooden benches worn smooth by years of prayer. Candles flickered near the altar, and a faint scent of incense filled the air. There were only a few people. No stage lights, no music, no fanfare, just a handful of souls singing softly. When they began to sing Amazing Grace, Keanu felt a lump rise in his throat. The words were old, but they carried something alive. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, he saw his mother smiling, her hand on his shoulder, whispering that same hymn years ago. After the service, Jacob placed a hand on his arm and said, "You don't have to understand everything right now. You just have to keep walking toward the light." Keanu nodded slowly. That night, as he walked home beneath the streetlights, he thought about that phrase. He realized he had spent his entire career walking toward the brightest lights in the world, but they had never shown him truth. Now he was following a gentler light, one that didn't blind, only guided. A few days later, while standing again at the same crosswalk where he had first met Jacob, he saw a young woman crying beside the curb. She looked lost, holding a small suitcase and a photo of a man in her hands. Keanu didn't hesitate. He offered her a bottle of water and asked if she was all right. Between tears, she told him she had come to the city chasing dreams, but her fiancé had left her and she had nowhere to go. Without thinking, Keanu called Jacob, and within an hour, the woman had a bed at the mission and a warm meal waiting. That night, as he watched her eat with trembling hands, Keanu realized something profound. Faith wasn't about grand gestures or miracles in the sky. It was about being there when someone else's world fell apart. Weeks turned into months, and Keanu's visits to the mission became daily rituals. He swept floors, served food, listened to stories, and prayed silently. He noticed how the city looked different now, how behind every angry face there was pain, behind every silence there was a story. The fame that once isolated him now allowed him to connect. He could walk into any room, and people would listen, not because he was famous, but because he finally spoke with truth. He began funding small projects quietly, renovating shelters, buying warm clothes for winter, repairing old kitchens, but he never allowed his name to be used. "If they know who gave it," he told Jacob, "they'll look at me. I want them to look up." One evening, after another day of service, Jacob turned to him and said, "You've been searching for Jesus, haven't you?" Keanu looked down, unsure how to answer. Jacob smiled and continued, "You've already found him. You just didn't notice. He's been walking beside you in every hungry man you've fed, in every tear you've wiped away. That's where he lives." Those words sank deep into Keanu's heart. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "The greatest revelation isn't seeing God above you, it's recognizing Him beside you." When he looked at the city's skyline later that night, the lights no longer tempted him. They reminded him of souls, millions of them, each trying to find their way through darkness. He whispered, "Use me however you want." It wasn't a prayer of fame, nor a cry of desperation. It was surrender, a soft, beautiful surrender. The man who once walked alone through corridors of cameras now walked among strangers and found family. The actor who once played heroes on screen was learning how to live like one in silence. And though no one would ever film these moments, heaven surely watched. Because somewhere between the crosswalks and the forgotten streets, between a broken world and a healing heart, Keanu Reeves had begun to understand what it truly meant to follow the one who gave everything without asking for applause. Breaking the chains of fame, the mornings in Los Angeles had changed for Keanu Reeves. They were no longer marked by studio calls, luxury cars, or appointments with stylists. They began instead with the hum of street traffic, the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery, and the sound of Jacob's soft laughter as he poured coffee into paper cups for volunteers. The mission under the highway bridge had become more than a place of service. It had become a sanctuary. Here, people came broken and left lighter. Here, the world forgot about fame and remembered love. Keanu had found his peace not in silence, but in serving others. Yet, as his heart grew freer, the world of Hollywood began to tighten its grip again, trying to reclaim what it thought belonged to it. One afternoon, as Keanu was sweeping the small courtyard outside the Mission, a black SUV stopped by the curb. The door opened and out stepped his longtime agent, Mark, dressed in his usual designer suit and restless energy. "You're impossible to find, man," he said, walking up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The studio's been calling for weeks. They want you for a new project. Massive budget, award potential, everything." Keanu leaned on his broom, his expression calm. "I'm not interested, Mark." The agent blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. "Not interested? Keanu, this could redefine your career. You've disappeared for months. People think you're retiring. Come back with this role and you'll own the industry again." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's the problem, Mark. I don't want to own anything anymore. I just want to live." Mark laughed uneasily, glancing at the faded walls and the people lining up for food. "You're helping the homeless now? You could fund 100 shelters if you just signed this contract. Why waste your time here?" Keanu's voice softened. "Because here, I'm not acting." The words landed heavier than intended. Mark didn't understand. How could he? In the world they had built together, worth was measured by box office numbers and awards, not by the quiet dignity of feeding strangers. But Keanu had begun to see how fame, disguised as success, had chained his soul. Every compliment had become a chain, every headline a cage. And now, standing in the sunlight among people the world ignored, he felt freer than he ever had on any film set. That evening, he sat on the church steps with Jacob, watching the sunset burn gold across the horizon. "It's strange," Keanu said, his voice thoughtful. "When I had everything, I felt empty. Now that I have nothing, I feel whole." Jacob nodded slowly. "Fame feeds the ego, not the soul. And the ego is always hungry." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the laughter of children playing nearby. Then Jacob added quietly, "God doesn't need your fame, Keanu. He needs your faith." In the weeks that followed, Keanu began selling off parts of his old life. He sold one of his sports cars, then another. He quietly liquidated some investments and funneled the money through anonymous donations. He visited hospitals, not for publicity, but to listen. He spent nights sitting beside strangers whose lives were hanging by a thread, holding hands that trembled from pain, offering words that came from somewhere deeper than himself. The city began to whisper about him. Keanu Reeves is giving away his fortune. Keanu seen at shelters again. Keanu turns down multi-million-dollar deal for charity work. Reporters tried to find him. Cameras followed him, but he stayed hidden, choosing places where lights didn't reach. His kindness was no longer a rumor. It had become a quiet revolution. One night, while walking back from the Mission, he found a young man sitting on the curb, shaking, a needle fallen from his hand. Keanu knelt beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, "you're not alone." The man looked up, his eyes filled with tears and shame. "Why do you care?" he whispered. Keanu's answer was simple. "Because someone cared for me when I didn't deserve it." He helped the man to his feet, guided him to the Mission, and stayed with him all night. When dawn came, the young man was sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. Keanu sat quietly beside him, realizing that love was not about words or speeches. It was presence. It was showing up when the world turned away. But his journey wasn't without conflict. Some people in his old circle began to mock him, calling his transformation a midlife crisis or a spiritual stunt. Studio executives sent letters, pleading for his return. A few even accused him of hypocrisy, saying he used faith as publicity. Yet through all the noise, he remained calm. He remembered the mountain wind, the words of Jacob, and the stillness that came only from surrender. He didn't need to defend his path because truth didn't shout. It endured. Months passed. Keanu's life had become an intricate rhythm of service and solitude. He still read scripts occasionally, not to return to fame, but to understand how easily the world confused illusion with truth. The stories felt hollow now, tales of vengeance, greed, and survival that mirrored the same emptiness he had escaped. He wondered why so few dared to write stories about Grace. Maybe because Grace was too quiet for the world's taste. One evening, Jacob fell ill. The mission grew somber. The laughter faded, replaced by worry. Keanu stayed by his bedside in the small church office that served as Jacob's room. The older man smiled weakly. "Don't look so sad," he whispered. "We all have our exits, brother. But remember what I told you. Broken things are what God loves to fix." Keanu held his hand tightly, tears welling. "You fixed more lives than you'll ever know." Jacob smiled faintly. "I didn't fix them. I just pointed them toward the one who could." His voice grew softer. "Promise me something. Don't hide your light. The world needs to see what faith looks like in motion." Keanu nodded, his throat tight. That night, Jacob slipped away quietly, his last words a prayer for peace. Keanu sat in the empty room long after dawn, staring at the small wooden cross above the bed. For the first time since he'd met Jacob, he felt lost again. But as the first rays of sunlight touched the window, he realized that faith wasn't about never losing your way. It was about trusting the light to find you again. He stood, placed a hand over the cross, and whispered, "Thank you." Then he stepped outside, breathing in the morning air. The city was waking up, unaware that one of its quiet saints had gone home. That day, Keanu decided to continue Jacob's work. He expanded the mission, creating a foundation in memory of his friend. But he refused to name it after either of them. The sign simply read, "Grace Street, for anyone who needs a second chance." Volunteers came in droves, inspired not by fame, but by the authenticity of the cause. They fed thousands, clothed hundreds, and reminded everyone who passed through that love didn't come from power, it came from compassion. As he stood watching the line of people waiting for food one evening, Keanu thought about how far he had come. He had once believed his legacy would be written in film credits and awards, but now he saw it etched in the quiet smiles of those who found hope again. He whispered, "This is the only script worth living." And though the city around him still pulsed with ambition and vanity, he walked through it unchained. A man who had once been owned by the world, but now belonged only to Grace. For the first time in his life, Keanu Reeves didn't just act kindness, he lived it. He no longer feared losing fame because he had found faith. And in that trade, he discovered what the world's richest never could, that the only crown worth wearing was humility, and the only light worth chasing was love. The call of the carpenter. The sun had long set over Los Angeles, and the city glowed beneath a blanket of lights that flickered like restless souls. Somewhere in the maze of that glittering world, Keanu Reeves sat alone inside a small church on the east side of town. The wooden benches creaked softly beneath his weight, and a single candle flickered before the altar, its flame trembling like a heartbeat. It had been months since Jacob's passing, months since Keanu had decided to continue his friend's mission, yet tonight, something deeper stirred within him, a restlessness that wasn't born of sadness but of calling. He had already given up fame, fortune, and everything that once defined him, but he could feel that his journey of faith was only beginning. It was as if something, or someone, was whispering through the silence, asking him to go further than charity, to move from doing good to becoming good itself. He remembered Jacob's last words. "Don't hide your light. The world needs to see what faith looks like in motion." At the time, he had thought Jacob meant to keep the mission alive. But now, he began to understand that it wasn't just about running a shelter. It was about living faith so openly that others would see the reflection of grace through him. Yet that thought frightened him, because fame had already made him visible once, and visibility had nearly destroyed his peace. How could he show faith without being worshipped for it? How could he live like Christ in a world that only knew how to idolize? As he wrestled with these thoughts, he walked to the front of the church and looked at the wooden cross hanging above the altar. It was plain, unpolished, slightly crooked, the kind of cross no one would photograph, and yet its simplicity pierced him. He thought about the carpenter who once carried it, the hands that shaped wood and healed wounds in the same lifetime. For years, Keanu had played roles of heroes and warriors, but now he was drawn to the quiet power of a man who conquered the world through love and forgiveness. He whispered, "Show me how to follow you without becoming a shadow of myself." The words echoed softly in the empty chapel, and something within him shifted, not like thunder or revelation, but like a seed cracking open in the soil of his soul. Days later, Keanu received a call from a film producer, an old friend who had been one of the few to respect his silence. "I know you've turned down everything," the man said, "but hear me out. It's not a blockbuster. It's a small independent project, a story about redemption, forgiveness, and a man finding faith after losing everything. We thought of you instantly." Keanu didn't answer immediately. He had vowed to leave the world of acting behind, but this offer didn't sound like the usual glamour. It sounded like a mirror. That night he prayed for clarity, asking, "Is this pride calling me back, or purpose?" When dawn came, his answer wasn't words, but peace. A stillness that told him it was time to use his voice again, not for applause, but for truth. When filming began, everything felt different. The set was modest, the budget small, but the atmosphere sacred. The story was about a carpenter who had lost his family and faith, only to find God again while rebuilding a burned-down church. Keanu threw himself into the role with humility rather than ambition. He stayed quiet between takes, often sitting alone reading scripture, treating the story not as performance but as prayer. The crew noticed the change. There were no ego clashes, no rehearsed smiles, no vanity. One of the younger actors approached him one day and said, "You carry peace around like it's part of your costume." Keanu smiled gently and replied, "It's not a costume. It's what happens when you stop pretending." During one of the final scenes, Keanu's character was supposed to kneel before a half-built cross, look up, and whisper, "I surrender." The director called for action, but what happened next wasn't in the script. Keanu knelt, and as the camera rolled he began to cry, not as the character but as himself. Every weight, every regret, every unspoken question that had haunted him for years poured out. When he said the words, "I surrender," they weren't acting. They were truth. When the director yelled, "Cut," no one spoke for a long time. The crew knew they had just witnessed something real, something holy. Later that evening, the cinematographer quietly said, "I think we filmed a prayer." The film released quietly. No massive marketing campaign, no red carpet. Yet it spread through whispers, touching hearts around the world. People who had long turned away from faith found themselves weeping in theaters. Letters began arriving at Keanu's foundation from strangers saying the movie had brought them hope. A woman wrote that she had decided to forgive her estranged son after watching it. A man said it helped him survive addiction. Keanu read each letter slowly, tears glistening in his eyes, realizing that God had taken his old gift, storytelling, and turned it into ministry. But the real transformation came one afternoon when he visited a small carpentry workshop on the outskirts of the city. He had heard that an elderly craftsman there repaired furniture for free for struggling families. Curious, Keanu went to meet him. The man, gray-haired and quiet, welcomed him without recognition. His hands were steady as he sanded an old wooden table. They talked about simple things: wood, time, patience, until the craftsman said something that struck him deeply. "You can tell the strength of a man by how he rebuilds what others have thrown away." Keanu stood in silence, understanding that this was not about furniture, but life. He began visiting the workshop regularly, helping with small repairs, learning the beauty of shaping wood. The rhythm of the hammer and chisel became a form of meditation. One day, the craftsman said, "You know, you've got the hands of a carpenter, not an actor." Keanu smiled softly. "Maybe both build things," he said. "One just uses wood. The other uses stories." But later that night, sitting under the stars, he realized he was wrong. They both built souls, his own included. As the months passed, he divided his time between the mission, the workshop, and quiet evenings of reflection. Reporters eventually found him again, wanting interviews about his spiritual film. He refused them all, issuing only one statement through his foundation. "I didn't leave Hollywood. I just followed a different director." The world quoted it endlessly, but few understood its depth. Keanu no longer lived for headlines. He lived for moments unseen, comforting a dying man, building a table for a family, sitting with a child who had lost hope. One evening, while walking home from the workshop, a car sped through a red light and nearly hit a boy crossing the street. Keanu reacted without thinking, pulling the child out of harm's way. The car screeched to a stop and the driver, shaken and pale, stepped out, apologizing profusely. The boy clung to Keanu's leg, trembling. When his mother arrived moments later, tears streaming down her face, she said, "You saved him." Keanu shook his head gently. "No," he whispered. "Grace did." That moment stayed with him for weeks, not because of the danger, but because of what it revealed. That every breath, every heartbeat, was borrowed time meant to be used for love. He often returned to that same crosswalk afterward, standing quietly and watching the world pass. Sometimes, strangers recognized him and approached, expecting the celebrity they'd seen on screen. But what they found instead was a man who listened more than he spoke, whose eyes held both sorrow and peace, the kind of peace that doesn't come from comfort, but from surrender. As the mission grew and the world began to associate his name with compassion instead of fame, Keanu often thought about the carpenter from Nazareth, the one who had built the greatest legacy without wealth or power. He realized that faith wasn't about escaping the world. It was about transforming it through quiet acts of love. The chains of fame had once kept him bound to applause. Now the call of the carpenter had set him free to serve. And in that freedom, he found what every artist secretly searches for: not perfection, not immortality, but meaning. A purpose larger than himself. He had once lived to be remembered. Now he lived to reflect. And in that reflection, the world began to see a glimmer of something divine. Not because of who he was, but because of who he had finally learned to follow. The light beyond the screen. The world had changed, though perhaps not in the way people usually meant when they said it. The pace of life was still relentless, the hunger for fame still loud, and the noise of success still drowned out the whispers of truth. But somewhere between the world's endless wanting and its aching silence, one man had quietly learned how to live differently. Keanu Reeves no longer walked on red carpets or posed beneath spotlights, but he carried light with him wherever he went. Years had passed since his last major film, and though his name had faded from billboards, it had etched itself somewhere far more enduring, in the quiet hearts of people he had helped without cameras or applause. The Grace Street mission had grown beyond anything Jacob could have imagined. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It had become a living story of transformation. There were now branches in 3 cities, small, humble places where food was shared, hands were held, and hope was rediscovered. Volunteers called it the Silent Light, because its founder refused to let it bear his name. Keanu spent his mornings among them, serving breakfast, sweeping floors, or simply sitting beside those who felt unseen. The people loved him not as an actor or a star, but as one of their own. He never preached, never announced his faith like a banner. Instead, he lived it quietly, the way a candle lights a room, without noise, without pride, only warmth. He had long stopped granting interviews, but journalists occasionally tried to reach him. Some wanted to understand his faith, others wanted to frame it into a story of Hollywood's lost soul who found religion. Keanu always smiled and turned them away. "I didn't find religion," he once told a curious volunteer. "I found relationship. The difference is that one lives in buildings, the other lives in hearts." And with that, he would go back to washing dishes or handing out blankets as if the world didn't need to understand him at all. Yet the world did notice. People began speaking of him in reverent tones, how he funded surgeries for children in need, how he appeared at hospitals unannounced to sit with parents waiting through the night, how he sent letters of encouragement to strangers who wrote to him about loss. These stories spread across social media like ripples of peace in a restless ocean. Some refused to believe they were true, claiming they were myths about a man too kind to exist. But those who had seen him in person, who had felt his presence in their darkest hours, knew better. One rainy evening, Keanu sat alone in his workshop, running his hand across the smooth edge of a wooden table he had been building for weeks. The smell of cedar filled the air, and the rhythm of raindrops on the roof played like a hymn. He had learned patience from wood, the art of waiting, the quiet acceptance of imperfection. Every groove, every knot told a story, and in each flaw he saw grace. As he finished sanding the final edge, he smiled softly. The table wasn't perfect, but it was whole, and that was enough. Perhaps, he thought, that was how life worked too. He took a walk through the city after midnight, his hood drawn over his head. The streets shimmered with reflections of neon lights, and puddles rippled beneath his boots. Passing an old theater, he paused. The marquee, weathered and broken, still displayed the faint letters of a movie he had starred in years ago. For a moment he stared at his own faded name, glowing dimly in the rain. It felt like looking at a ghost, a reminder of a life that once felt larger than life itself. He whispered to the empty street, "I used to think that was me." Then he turned and kept walking. As he neared the church where Jacob had once preached, he noticed a small crowd gathered outside despite the rain. Curious, he approached quietly. They were volunteers from Grace Street, serving soup and handing out coats to people huddled under umbrellas. He joined them without saying a word, taking a ladle and filling bowls until his arms ached. When one of the volunteers realized who he was, she smiled and said, "You shouldn't be out here in this weather." Keanu chuckled softly. "This is exactly where I should be." The woman nodded and handed him another bowl. Later that night, as the rain eased, he sat on the church steps watching the city lights fade into mist. He thought of Jacob, of his mother, of every soul who had crossed his path on this long road from fame to faith. He realized that every one of them had been a teacher in disguise, shaping his spirit the way a sculptor shapes stone, painfully, patiently, purposefully. His fame had been a furnace, his sorrow a chisel, and faith the steady hand that had turned both into something beautiful. He whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for the world. For the lonely, for the proud, for the broken, for the ones still chasing light in the wrong places, show them what you showed me. His voice cracked, but there was no sadness in it, only gratitude. He understood now that the greatest miracle was not turning water into wine or walking on water. It was learning to love without reason, to forgive without condition, to give without being seen. The next morning, the sky was clear and gold with dawn. Keanu rode his motorcycle out of the city toward the mountains. The road curved through fields of green and light, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was leaving anything behind. The mountain air welcomed him like an old friend. He parked near the cabin where his journey had begun, the same cabin where he had first prayed for purpose. The door creaked open, and sunlight poured into the dust. He knelt by the window, remembering the man he had been, the restless, famous, hollow soul, and smiled at how far grace had carried him. He spent the day repairing the cabin, patching holes in the roof, fixing the old fireplace, sweeping the floors. Each nail driven into wood felt symbolic, a declaration that his life had come full circle. As evening descended, he built a small fire, sat on the floor, and opened his mother's Bible. Her handwriting was still there in the margins, faint but clear. The greatest victory is not fame, but faith. He closed the book, tears glimmering in the firelight, and whispered, "You were right, Mom." That night, he dreamed again. He was walking down a familiar path, the same one from years ago, but this time the red carpet had turned into a simple dirt road lined with wildflowers. At the end stood the same man in white, the one from his first vision. But this time the man was smiling. "You've come far," he said. Keanu nodded, his heart trembling. "I just followed the light." The man's eyes softened. "And now you are one." He woke to birdsong and sunlight spilling across his face. The world was still the same, still broken, still loud, but he was no longer afraid of it. He knew now that his purpose wasn't to escape the darkness but to carry light into it. He packed his things, closed the cabin door, and walked down the trail toward the horizon, the morning wind lifting his hair like a benediction. As he reached the road, he stopped one last time to look back at the mountains. "Thank you," he said simply. Then he climbed onto his motorcycle and rode away, the engine humming like a heartbeat, his silhouette fading into the glow of a new dawn. He didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time in his life, that didn't matter. He had already arrived, not at fame, not at peace, but at purpose. And somewhere beyond the noise of the world, the light he carried kept burning, quietly, endlessly, like a candle in the heart of creation.